He never returned from the river trail in 1991. Then a backpack surfaced in a drainage ditch during flooding. The old backpack, ripped and mud-caked, snagged on a rusted culvert grate where the swollen drainage ditch emptied its fury into the churning river. 33 years after he walked into the trees along the river trail and never came out. A lone hiker, navigating the slick, debris-strewn aftermath of the once-in-a-century storm, spotted the faded canvas, a dull, forgotten green against the brown violence of the floodwaters. He almost passed it by, another piece of refuse disgorged by the ravaged landscape, but something in its defeated slump, its improbable anchor against the torrent, caught his eye. With a branch, he pried it loose, the fabric tearing further, with a sound like a sigh. Inside, shielded by a remarkable confluence of rotted nylon and miraculously preserved plastic wrapping a bundle of old park leaflets, was a disposable camera, its cheerful yellow casing grimly ironic. A waterlogged journal whose pages were swollen into a single fragile block, and a folded park map, stiff with dried mud and something darker, something that flaked away like rust under his hesitant touch, revealing a stain the color of old blood. The river, they had said back in 1991, had claimed Elias Vance. Swallowed him whole, leaving no trace, no echo, just a sudden, deafening silence where a man had been. Now, 3 decades and a deluge later, the river, or perhaps some more patient, more meticulous force, had offered this fragmented testament, a collection of lost moments and a single, terrifying question mark. The weight of the sodden canvas felt immense, far heavier than its meager contents, heavy with the years of silence, the years of unknowing, the years that had eroded hope into a dull, persistent ache for the woman who still waited, who had never truly believed the river was the only culprit. He had been an experienced hiker, Elias, methodical, careful. The trail was familiar, a comfortable embrace of dappled sunlight and whispering pines, not a treacherous beast lying in wait. Yet, he had vanished. One moment, a figure receding into the green, a wave goodbye, a promise of return by dusk. The next, an absence. A void that spread, consuming the search parties, the tracking dogs, the frantic calls that echoed unanswered through the indifferent trees. The forest kept its secrets then, and the river, its accomplice, offered no clues, only its ceaseless, murmuring flow, a lullaby of forgetting. The discovery now, amidst the wreckage of a storm that had clawed at the very bones of the land, felt less like a finding and more like an exhumation, a reluctant surrender of a long-held secret. The hiker stared at the objects in his hand, the weight of their untold story pressing down on him, the chill of the receding floodwaters seeping into his bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep and cold, that this was not just lost property. This was an answer, or perhaps the beginning of one, to a question someone had stopped asking aloud, but had never, ever stopped feeling. The camera, in particular, held a strange allure, a promise of frozen moments, a glimpse into a past that had, until this moment, been entirely erased. What final sights had its lens captured? What truth lay dormant on its undeveloped film, preserved by chance and the slow seep of time? The mud on his hands felt suddenly different, imbued with the gravity of this unexpected resurrection. The news, when it finally reached Sarah Vance, came via a crackling phone line, a young, hesitant voice on the other end. A deputy whose tenure at the small county sheriff's office likely post-dated Elias's disappearance by a good decade, 33 years, an entire lifetime for some. For Sarah, it had been a single, unending day, marked by the rising and setting of the sun, each cycle a fresh confirmation of his absence. She had been young then, vibrant, their life a tapestry woven with shared dreams and the easy comfort of unspoken understanding. His love for the wilderness was a part of that tapestry, a thread she admired, even if she didn't always share his enthusiasm for its more rugged demands. He had gone alone that day, a rare solo trip, a need for solitude, and the deep communion he found amongst the ancient trees and the patient river. She remembered the way the morning light caught his hair, still dark then, as he leaned down to kiss her goodbye, the scent of coffee and pine needles on his worn flannel shirt. "Be careful," she'd said, the words a casual ritual, not a premonition. "I always am," he'd replied, his smile confident, reassuring. The backpack. They'd found his backpack. The words hung in the sterile air of her meticulously kept kitchen, a space that still held faint ghosts of his presence. The mug he preferred, the worn spot on the linoleum where he always stood, staring out at the bird feeder. Her hand, gnarled now with age and the quiet labor of solitary years, tightened on the receiver, the knuckles white. A backpack, after all this time. It was impossible. It had to be a mistake. They had searched for months, combed every inch of that trail, the surrounding woods, the treacherous banks of the river serpent, as the locals sometimes called it. Nothing. Not a footprint, not a dropped glove, not a single thread to unravel the mystery of his vanishing. The official report had been concise, clinical: lost hiker, presumed drowned, accidental death. She had nodded, signed the papers, accepted the sympathetically tilted heads and the hushed condolences, but in the deepest recess of her heart, a small stubborn ember of disbelief had glowed, refusing to be extinguished by the cold tide of official pronouncements. Elias was not careless. He was not reckless. The river, as powerful as it was, felt too simple an answer, too neat a conclusion for the man who knew its currents, its moods, its hidden dangers, better than most. The young deputy was saying something about coming down to the station, about identification. As if she wouldn't know every stitch, every buckle, every faded patch on the backpack that had been his companion on countless adventures. It was the one he'd bought on their trip to Colorado, the one with the slightly dodgy zipper he always meant to fix. The details, dormant for decades, rushed back with the clarity of yesterday. The silence in her small house, usually a familiar comfort, now pressed in, heavy and suffocating. She looked at his hiking boots, still standing by the back door, laces tied, as if waiting for his return. For 33 years they had waited. A monument to a hope she had outwardly denied but inwardly clung to with the tenacity of a drowning swimmer. The drive to the station was a blur, the familiar landmarks of the small town passing by like scenes from a dream, detached and unreal. The world had moved on, buildings had risen and fallen, faces had aged, but for Sarah, time had fractured in 1991, one part of her forever frozen on that sun-dappled morning, the other trudging through the empty landscape of the years that followed. The sheriff's office was a newer building than the one she remembered from those frantic early days, but the scent of stale coffee and bureaucratic indifference was timeless. An older officer, his face a roadmap of weary experience, greeted her with a kindness that felt genuine, a stark contrast to the nervous energy of the young deputy who had made the call. This older man, she vaguely recalled, might have been a rookie back then, part of the endless stream of uniforms that had offered little comfort and no answers. He led her to a small, sterile room. And there it was. Lying on a stainless steel table, cleaned of the worst of the river's grime, but still bearing the undeniable marks of its long ordeal, was the backpack. Her breath caught in her throat, a painful, jagged thing. It was his. The faded green, now mottled and stained, the distinctive leather patch on the front, even the telltale strain near the main zipper. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she reached out, her hand trembling, to steady herself on the cool metal of the table. It was like seeing a ghost, a tangible piece of a past she had painstakingly, painfully, tried to relegate to memory. The officer spoke softly, explaining where it had been found, the circumstances of the flood. She barely heard him. Her gaze was fixed on the backpack, and then on the items laid out beside it. The disposable camera, its bright casing a cruel mockery. The journal, a swollen, pulpy mass, its secrets perhaps lost forever to the water's embrace. And the map, with that dark, flaking stain. His blood? The thought, unbidden, sent a fresh spear of ice through her. She reached for it, her fingers tracing the outline of the stain, a ragged, ugly shape that seemed to consume a particular, less traveled section of the river trail. An area known for its dense undergrowth and treacherous footing. Elias had marked it once, years ago, with a penciled X, intending to explore it, a small loop off the main path that few bothered with. Had he gone there? Had that been where his journey ended? The officer cleared his throat gently. "Ma'am, we'll need to send these items to the lab, the camera especially. There might be something on the film if it survived. The journal, well, they'll do what they can. It doesn't look promising." Survive. The word echoed in the sterile room. Elias hadn't survived, but perhaps a fragment of his story had. A tiny, impossible hope flickered within her, quickly followed by a familiar dread. What if the truth, if it could even be found in these ruined relics, was worse than the not knowing? For 33 years, she had lived with the ambiguity, a canvas of possibilities, some benign, some terrifying. Now she was being offered a single, stark image, and she wasn't sure she was strong enough to look, but she had to, for Elias. For the part of her that had never stopped searching, never stopped waiting for a sign, any sign, from the silent, indifferent wilderness that had claimed him. She nodded, a single, jerky movement. "Yes, do whatever you can." Her voice was a whisper, rough with unshed tears and the dust of decades. The weight of his absence, a familiar cloak, settled around her shoulders, but now it was heavier, infused with a new, terrible proximity to the end. The river had given up its dead, or at least a piece of him. And she, who had thought herself inured to pain, braced for a fresh wave of it, a wave that threatened to pull her under just as the river might have pulled him. The journey back home was even more disorienting, the world outside her car window seeming too bright, too normal, too oblivious to the earthquake that had just shattered the fragile piece of her carefully constructed life. The boots by the door no longer looked expectant, but accusatory. The days that followed were a torment of waiting, a slow, agonizing crawl of hours. Sleep offered little respite, haunted by images of the river, the backpack, the dark stain on the map. She moved through her house like an automaton, the simple rituals of daily life, making tea, tending her small garden, reading the paper, feeling hollow, performative. The local news had picked up the story, a brief, sensationalized piece about the decades-old mystery potentially being solved. Strangers offered condolences, their faces etched with a morbid curiosity that Sarah found unbearable. She retreated further into herself, the silence of her home, her only sanctuary. The older officer, whose name she learned was Miller, called occasionally with updates, his voice a calm, steady presence in the maelstrom of her emotions. The journal, as predicted, was largely unsalvageable. Forensic experts, with painstaking care, had managed to separate a few of the outer pages, but the ink had bled into illegible Rorschach blots, the words dissolving into meaningless patterns. Yet, here and there, a single stark word or a fragmented phrase had survived, like isolated islands in a sea of decay. Shadows. The word appeared twice, clearly legible on a torn scrap of page. Watching. Further down, on another fragment, just that one word, stark and chilling, not alone. These phrases, stripped of context, were more terrifying than a full narrative might have been. They hinted at a presence, an unseen observer, a creeping dread that had little to do with the natural hazards of the trail. Sarah held photocopies of these fragments, her fingers tracing the ghostly letters, her mind racing. Had Elias felt threatened? Had he sensed someone following him? The careful, methodical hiker she knew would have been attuned to the nuances of the forest, to any discordant note in its ancient symphony. These were not the words of a man enjoying a peaceful communion with nature. These were the words of a man on edge, a man aware of something beyond the rustling leaves and the chirping birds. Then, there was the map. Lieutenant Miller had confirmed the stain was indeed blood. Elias's blood type. A small, almost insignificant detail medically, but a universe of implication for Sarah. Blood meant injury. Blood meant violence. The official theory of an accidental drowning, already so flimsy in her mind, began to disintegrate entirely. The blood wasn't just a stain, it was a focal point, a dark star around which the fragmented clues began to orbit. It was concentrated over that little-used offshoot trail, the one marked with Elias's faint pencil X. Had he been attacked there? Had he fought back? The image of her gentle, thoughtful husband engaged in a desperate struggle was almost unbearable, yet the evidence, however scant, pointed in that horrifying direction. The silence from the lab regarding the disposable camera was the loudest of all. Each passing day without news stretched her nerves tighter. What could take so long? Was the film damaged beyond recovery? Or were they seeing things they were reluctant to share? She imagined the technicians in a darkened room, peering at ghostly images, piecing together the last moments of a life interrupted. "You find yourself thinking about what you might see," she had told Miller, her voice trembling over the phone. "You prepare for the worst, the very worst. But what if the worst is something you can't even imagine?" He had offered no platitudes, only a quiet assurance that they would tell her as soon as they knew anything definitive. His patience, his refusal to speculate, was both a comfort and a source of frustration. She needed to know, even if it destroyed her. The waiting was a crucible, burning away the last vestiges of a hope she hadn't even realized she still carried, the faint, irrational hope that he might have simply walked away, started a new life. Anything but the brutal finality that the emerging clues suggested. The house felt colder, the shadows deeper. The boots by the door now seemed to mock her, silent witnesses to a vigil that was perhaps, finally, nearing its end. Lieutenant Miller called on a Tuesday morning, his voice carefully neutral. "The film from the camera has been processed, Sarah. We have the prints. Can you come down to the station?" Just that. No hint of what they contained, no emotional inflection. But Sarah knew. The careful neutrality was a louder alarm than any siren. This was it. The culmination of 33 years of waiting, of wondering, of dreading. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She drove with an almost preternatural calm, a stillness at the eye of her internal storm. The town, the trees, the very air seemed to hold its breath. In the same sterile room as before, Miller waited. He looked older today, the lines on his face deeper, his eyes shadowed with a weariness that mirrored her own. He didn't offer her a seat immediately. Instead, he gestured to a series of glossy photographs laid out in a neat row on the steel table. There were perhaps a dozen of them. He began at one end. "The first few are what you'd expect. Landscape shots. The river, trees." He paused. "There's a selfie, Elias." Sarah stepped forward, her legs unsteady. The early photos were indeed unremarkable, almost painfully so. The familiar curve of the river serpent, sunlight glinting on its surface, towering pines, their needles forming a dense canopy. Then, Elias, his face, younger, vibrant, filled the frame. He was smiling, squinting slightly against the sun, a familiar woolen hat pulled low on his forehead. Behind him, the deep green of the forest, unaware, happy. A sob escaped her, a raw, ragged sound she couldn't suppress. Miller waited patiently, his gaze averted. She wiped her eyes, forcing herself to continue. The next few photos were different. Still the trail, but the angles were slightly off, the focus a little less sharp, as if taken in haste. One shot looked back down the path he had just traversed, a narrow ribbon of earth disappearing into the shadows. Why would he take that picture? Miller's voice was quiet. We think he heard something. Or saw something. That he was checking behind him. The sense of unease in the images was palpable, a creeping dread seeping through the glossy paper. Then, the final photograph. It was different from the others, darker, the perspective slightly tilted, as if the camera had been held at an awkward angle, perhaps low to the ground, or aimed upwards through dense foliage. For a moment, Sarah couldn't make out what she was seeing. It was a confusing mesh of leaves, branches, and deep shadow. Then, Miller pointed. There, look closely. In the upper quadrant of the photo, nestled amongst the dense leaves of an ancient oak, almost perfectly camouflaged, was a shape, a human shape. And as her eyes adjusted, as the impossible resolved into the undeniable, she saw it. A figure, partially obscured, but clearly holding something up to their eyes. Binoculars. Someone was watching Elias from the trees. Watching him with an unnerving stillness, a predatory focus. The air rushed from Sarah's lungs. The room tilted. The forest in the photograph, once a place of beauty in her memory of Elias, transformed into a place of silent, watching menace. He hadn't been alone. The fragmented words from the journal, shadows, watching, not alone, slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. This was the shadow. This was who was watching. This was why he was not alone. This was the last thing his camera had seen, or perhaps the last thing he had wanted it to see, a desperate, final act of witness. The image burned itself onto her retina, a horrifying tableau of watcher and watched. Elias, unsuspecting or perhaps just becoming aware, and this presence in the trees, observing, patient, hidden, it wasn't an accident. The blood on the map, the fragmented words from the journal, this final, damning photograph, they all pointed to something far more sinister than a simple fall or a misjudged river crossing. He had been stalked, hunted. The cold dread that had been a dull ache for years now sharpened into a spear of pure, unadulterated terror. Who was this person? Why? The questions clawed at her, relentless and unanswerable. Miller's voice, grave and low, broke the suffocating silence. We've enhanced this section. The quality isn't good. It was a cheap camera, difficult lighting, but he slid another print across the table, a grainy enlargement of the figure in the trees. The details were still frustratingly obscure. No discernible facial features, the clothing dark and nondescript. But the posture, the intent focus conveyed by the binoculars, was chillingly clear. This was no casual birdwatcher. This was someone with a purpose, and that purpose, Sarah knew with a certainty that settled like ice in her veins, had been malevolent. The blood on the map, she realized with a fresh wave of nausea, wasn't just from an injury. It was likely from the attack itself. That isolated offshoot trail, obscured by the stain, was where it had happened. Where Elias, perhaps after realizing he was being followed, perhaps attempting to lose his pursuer or confront them, had met his end. The forest, his sanctuary, had become his tomb, witnessed by a silent, hidden assailant. The thought of his final moments, the fear he must have felt, the desperate struggle that the bloodstain hinted at, was an agony almost beyond bearing. For 33 years, she had imagined him lost, perhaps confused, succumbing to the elements or the river's cold embrace. A tragedy, yes, but one tinged with the randomness of nature. This was different. This was calculated. This was evil. The carefully constructed narrative of an accidental death, the one that had allowed her a measure of peace, however fragile, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She looked at Miller, her eyes pleading. "What now? What can you do?" He met her gaze, his own filled with a grim understanding. "It's been 33 years, Sarah. The trail is cold, colder than any winter. If this person was a transient, a drifter, they're long gone. If they were local, memories fade, people move away or die. We can look at old reports from around that time, missing persons, any unusual sightings in that area, but the chances," he didn't need to finish the sentence. "The chances of finding this ghost, this shadow from a 3-decade-old photograph, were almost non-existent. There would be no justice, not in the way the world understood it. No arrest, no trial, no satisfying resolution. Only this terrible, incomplete knowledge. The weight of it pressed down on her, crushing the air from her lungs. The river hadn't taken him. A person had, a person who had watched him, stalked him, and then, with chilling anonymity, erased him from the world, leaving only these faint, ghostly traces to be discovered a lifetime later. The camera, intended to capture memories of beauty, had instead recorded the prelude to a nightmare, and she, his wife, was left with the final horrifying frame. The silence in the room was profound, broken only by the distant hum of office machinery, a mundane counterpoint to the extraordinary horror laid out on the table. The police, true to Miller's word, reopened the case, a formality more than a genuine investigation. They pored over microfiched newspapers from 1991, searching for reports of vagrants, hermits, or any unusual activities near the river trail around the time of Elias's disappearance. There were a few vague accounts, mostly dismissed at the time as local rumor or exaggeration, tales of a wild man occasionally glimpsed at the edges of the national forest, someone who shunned contact. Fiercely territorial, but these were ghosts of stories, too ephemeral to grasp, too distant to connect definitively to the figure in the photograph. The offshoot trail, where the bloodied map indicated Elias had likely been attacked, was revisited. Decades of leaf litter, fallen branches, and relentless regrowth had altered the landscape almost beyond recognition. The forest had reclaimed its own, diligently erasing the marks of human passage, human violence. There was no sign of a struggle, no forgotten weapon, no shallow grave. Nothing but the trees, ancient and indifferent, holding their counsel. Sarah, accompanied by Miller, whose quiet persistence had become a fragile lifeline, went to that spot herself. She needed to see it, to stand where Elias had stood, to try and feel what he might have felt in those final, terrifying moments. The air there was heavy, the sunlight struggling to penetrate the dense canopy. It was a place that felt removed, isolated, a pocket of deeper wilderness just steps from the more frequented path. As she stood there, the image from the photograph superimposed itself onto the landscape before her, the watching eyes, the glint of binoculars. She could almost feel the oppressive weight of that unseen gaze. It was here, it happened here. The certainty was a cold stone in her stomach. There was no single dramatic discovery, no sudden revelation of a hidden lair or a forgotten clue. Instead, there was just the profound, suffocating silence of the woods, the quiet rustle of leaves in the breeze, like whispers she couldn't quite decipher. Yet, in a way, the lack of further physical evidence was its own kind of confirmation. The killer had been thorough, or perhaps simply lucky, leaving nature to be their accomplice in concealing the crime. The forest had swallowed the truth whole, only to regurgitate these few indigestible fragments decades later through the violent upheaval of the flood. The figure in the photograph remained a cipher, an anonymous monster. Perhaps they were long dead, taking their secret with them. Perhaps they still lived, an ordinary life masking an extraordinary darkness. Sarah would never know. The thought was a bitter pill, yet mixed with the bitterness was a strange, unwelcome sense of release. The ambiguity of lost had been replaced by the terrible clarity of taken. The not knowing had been a diffuse, haunting ache. This new knowing was a sharp, defined wound, but a wound that could perhaps begin to heal, or at least scar over. The world felt different now, tainted by this revealed malice, yet also strangely more real. The vague specter of accidental death had been a comforting lie, and the truth, however horrific, had a certain grim solidity. Elias hadn't just wandered off and succumbed to misfortune. He had faced an adversary, a human darkness. There was a terrible kind of dignity in that, a resistance implied even in his presumed defeat. He hadn't simply vanished, he had been stolen. Days turned into weeks. The initial flurry of revived media interest faded. The old case files were reshelved, thick with the dust of unanswered questions. The figure in the photograph remained a ghost, a grainy enigma. For Sarah, however, something fundamental had shifted. The discovery of the backpack, the journal fragments, the horrifying finality of that last photograph had not brought closure in the neat, satisfying way television dramas portrayed. There was no justice, no retribution for the life stolen. The killer, if still alive, was free, anonymous, perhaps utterly unaware that their secret had been partially unearthed. Yet there was a different kind of ending. The gnawing uncertainty that had shadowed her for 33 years had, in its own brutal way, been resolved. She knew now that Elias hadn't simply been careless, hadn't been claimed by an indifferent river. He had been a victim of human malice, a targeted individual in a place he had loved. The terrible knowledge was a heavy cloak, yet it was a cloak she could finally, in some way, claim. It was his story, his ending, however tragic, and it had been returned to her. She found herself drawn back to the river trail, not to the ominous offshoot where he had likely met his end, but to the gentler stretches, the places where sunlight dappled the water and the path was wide and welcoming. She walked slowly, the backpack, his backpack, now cleaned and carefully preserved, held in her hands, not as a burden, but as a connection. It was all she had left of him, this tangible link to his final days, his final moments. The river still flowed, indifferent to her grief, to his fate, to the secrets it had briefly surrendered. But now, its murmur sounded different to her. It was no longer the sound of a thief, but of a witness, a keeper of time. She imagined Elias walking these paths, his gaze sweeping the trees, his mind perhaps on the beauty around him, or perhaps, in those last hours, on the growing unease, the sense of being watched. The photographs, she kept them in a small cedar box, alongside the few legible fragments from his journal. She didn't look at them often, she didn't need to. The images were seared into her memory. Especially the last one, the watcher in the trees. Sometimes, in the quiet of her evenings, she would take out the selfie Elias had taken, his smiling face, so full of life, so unaware of the darkness that lurked just beyond the frame. A profound sadness would wash over her, a grief made sharper by the terrible knowledge of what was to come for him. But it was a grief she could now fully inhabit, a grief that had a shape, a cause. No longer the formless dread of the unknown. One cool autumn afternoon, almost a year after the backpack had surfaced, Sarah returned to the river. She carried with her a single, smooth stone she had found on one of her walks, a stone warmed by the sun. She stood by the water's edge, where the current ran swift and deep, the place where, for so long, she had believed Elias had been lost. She held the stone for a long moment then, with a quiet sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all those silent years, she tossed it into the water. It made a small splash, then disappeared. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't forgetting. It was an acknowledgement. The river hadn't been the enemy. The true enemy remained a faceless shadow. But Elias was no longer just lost to the river. He was found, in memory, in truth, however terrible. The boots by her back door, were still there. They no longer seemed to wait with an impossible expectation. They were simply a reminder of a life lived, a love shared, and a mystery that, while not fully solved, had finally, painfully, yielded a part of its heart. The forest would keep its ultimate secrets, the watcher would remain unnamed, but Elias, in some small, profound way, had come home. The small town, nestled by the river Serpent, eventually settled back into its familiar rhythms, the brief resurgence of Elias Vance's story fading like the ripples from a stone tossed into deep water. For most, it became another local legend, a tragic footnote in the area's history, whispered about occasionally when storms were fierce or when hikers ventured too far off the beaten path. The grainy photograph of the watcher in the trees, published once in the local paper, became a source of morbid fascination for a few, a Rorschach test for local fears and anxieties, but for the authorities, it remained an unsolvable puzzle, a cold case relegated to the archives. Lieutenant Miller, nearing retirement, would sometimes pull out the file, stare at the image, at the sparse, haunting words from the journal. He, too, felt the weight of the unanswered questions, the frustration of a truth glimpsed but never fully grasped. He had offered Sarah what little solace the system could provide, a diligent effort, a respectful hearing, the cold comfort of confirmed facts where only speculation had existed. He knew it wasn't enough, could never be enough to fill the void left by such a loss, such a violation. But he had seen a change in her, a subtle shift from the brittle fragility of prolonged uncertainty to a quieter, more profound sorrow, a grief that had found its anchor in a terrible truth. Sarah continued her walks along the river, a familiar figure to those who frequented the trails. She no longer searched for answers in the rustling leaves or the flowing water. The answers she had were incomplete, horrifying, yet they were hers. The backpack, his backpack, occupied a place of honor in her small living room, a silent monument not to his death, but to his life, and to the enduring mystery that had, in its brutal unveiling, paradoxically brought a measure of peace. The why of it all would forever elude her. Was it a random act of violence, a territorial dispute with a disturbed individual living off the grid? A darker, more personal motive that lay buried too deep for discovery. The possibilities were a shadowy torment she learned to live with, pushing them to the periphery of her thoughts. What mattered, what she clung to, was the what. He hadn't simply been lost, he had been confronted, he had been seen. And in his final desperate moments, he had tried to show the world what he was seeing. That act of witness, captured by a cheap disposable camera, was a testament to his courage, his presence of mind even in the face of unimaginable terror. It was a small, flickering candle against an immense darkness, but for Sarah, it was enough to navigate by. The seasons turned, the river swelled with spring melts and dwindled in summer droughts. The forest shed its leaves and grew them anew. Life, indifferent and relentless, continued. Sarah Vance lived her remaining years with the quiet dignity of one who has faced the abyss and found, not solace, but a stark, unadorned understanding. The photograph of the watcher, that final, chilling image, never truly left her, a constant reminder of the hidden darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of the ordinary world. But alongside it, she held the image of Elias, smiling into his own camera, full of life, on a sunlit morning, before the shadows closed in. That was the image she chose to carry forward, the memory of the man, not the victim. The pain of his loss never fully disappeared, but it transformed, softened by the passage of time and the strange, bittersweet gift of a truth unearthed from a muddy grave after 33 long years. The river kept its secrets, but it had also, in its own inscrutable way, offered a reckoning. The finality of the discovery, though brutal, had etched a new landscape into Sarah's existence. The sharp edges of initial shock and horror, gradually softened, not into acceptance, but into a kind of weary coexistence with the truth. The world was no longer a place where her husband had simply vanished. It was a place where he had been stolen, and the knowing of it, the awful specificity, was a burden she carried with a quiet resilience that surprised even herself. She found herself thinking less about the monstrousness of the Watcher, whose identity remained a haunting blank, and more about Elias's final moments of clarity, his instinct to document, to leave a trace. That act, she came to believe, was not just for a faceless future investigator, but perhaps, in some way, for her. A message in a bottle, cast into the relentless current of time, hoping against hope it might one day reach a friendly shore. Her small garden became a greater focus, the cyclical rhythm of planting, tending, and harvesting a counterpoint to the static horror of the past. Each bloom, each ripe tomato was a small affirmation of life persisting, of beauty still capable of emerging from the dark earth. She spoke to Elias sometimes, not in a delusional way, but as one might speak to a cherished memory, sharing the small events of her day, the changing colors of the leaves, the first snowfall. He was a presence woven into the fabric of her solitude, no longer an aching void but a quiet companion. The town, too, began to associate her not just with the old tragedy, but with a certain strength, a stoicism that was both admirable and a little intimidating. They saw her walking the river trail, a solitary figure moving with a steady, unhurried pace, and they understood, or thought they understood, that this was her way of keeping vigil, of honoring a memory that refused to fade. The backpack, the camera, the stained map, and the pitifully few journal fragments were eventually returned to her, officially case-closed evidence. She stored them carefully, not as morbid relics, but as the last earthly possessions of the man she loved, fragments of his final journey. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was utterly still, she would open the cedar box and look at the selfie again, Elias's smile, a beacon against the encroaching darkness of what she knew followed. Tears would still come, but they were different now, less the tears of raw, uncomprehending grief, and more the tears of a love that had endured, a love that had outlasted the silence, the uncertainty, and even the terrible revelation. The mystery of the Watcher in the trees remained, a dark pocket in the fabric of the past, a reminder of the unanswered questions that life often leaves in its wake. But for Sarah, the central mystery, the one that had consumed her for more than 3 decades, had been laid bare. She knew what had happened to Elias, even if she didn't know every detail, every motive. And in that knowing, however painful, she found a strange, desolate kind of peace. The river continued its journey to the sea, carrying with it the echoes of countless stories, his among them. And Sarah, in her own way, continued hers, walking forward with the weight of memory, the burden of truth, and the enduring strength of a love that refused to be extinguished by time or tragedy. The boots by the door remained, a steadfast symbol, not of waiting, but of remembrance. A life violently ended, but a story finally told.